There was no room for 147 people in the boats, so they were forced onto a raft made from the wreckage of a French warship and tied behind the evacuation convoy. Then, the last towline was released. The boats kept moving toward the African coast. The raft did not. 13 days later, only 15 people were still alive when a ship found them. But the grounding of the Méduse was only the first failure. What happened after that rope went slack turned a maritime accident into a national scandal. The raft was about 65 feet long and 23 feet wide. On paper, that sounded large. In reality, most of it could not support a person above the water. The survivors later wrote that even when only 15 remained, there still was not enough room for everyone to lie down. Now, place roughly 10 times that number on it. Modern documentation from the Royal Museum's Greenwich gives the count as 146 men and 1 woman. The survivors' own published narrative rounded it to 150. As the crowd boarded, the platform sank. The center was packed shoulder to shoulder. At the front and rear, people stood waist-deep in the Atlantic. The small boats ahead were supposed to tow this mass toward land. At first, they formed a chain. Then, the chain began to separate. One boat released its line to avoid colliding with another. Boats that had broken away tried to maneuver back. For a short time, only the governor's boat remained connected to the raft. What happened next was disputed almost immediately. The governor later said the final rope broke when a wave pulled it tight. The men who survived the raft rejected that explanation. They wrote that the line had been deliberately let go. They even described a man in the governor's boat repeatedly asking whether he should release it, while another passenger shouted no. The survivors never forgot the moment the boats vanished. But to understand why 147 people were ever placed on that machine, we have to follow the decisions that brought Méduse onto a sandbank in the first place. In June 1816, Méduse left France as part of a 4-ship expedition bound for Senegal. France was returning to its former colony after the Napoleonic Wars. The frigate carried soldiers, officials, families, and the new governor. Its captain, Hugues du Roy de Chaumareix, had not been at sea for roughly 20 years. He was a royalist aristocrat appointed after the monarchy returned to power. His rank reflected political loyalty more clearly than recent experience. Méduse was the fastest ship in the group. Instead of remaining with the slower vessels, it moved ahead. The route brought the frigate dangerously close to the West African coast, where the shallow Arguin Bank stretched far into the Atlantic. On July 2nd, the water beneath the hull kept getting shallower. Warnings came too late or were not acted on effectively. Méduse struck the bank and stopped. The crew tried to free her. Cargo went overboard. Water casks were emptied. Anchors were carried out in an attempt to pull the frigate into deeper water. Nothing worked. There were not enough places in the ship's boats for everyone aboard, so spars, yards, planks, and rope were lashed together into a platform about 20 meters long. It had no proper steering system. Its railing rose only about 16 inches. The ends were so weak that they remained submerged, and the people assigned to it were not selected at random. The governor, senior officers, and many civilian passengers entered the boats. Soldiers, sailors, workers, and a small number of officers crowded onto the raft. 17 people chose to remain on the stranded frigate rather than board it. The evacuation itself destroyed much of what the raft needed. Barrels of flour had to be thrown away because the platform was already sinking. A bag containing about 25 pounds of biscuit fell into the sea and became a paste. 6 barrels of wine and 2 small casks of water were initially secured, but most of that water would soon be lost. Then the towline was released, and the raft's real voyage began. There were no oars capable of moving it. A makeshift mast could barely control its direction. Wind and current decided where it went. The people in the center fought to remain on the strongest section. Those at the edges were struck by waves or pulled through gaps in the timber. During the first night, the sea repeatedly rolled people from one end to the other. Some were swept away. Others, delirious from fear, exhaustion, and wine, threw themselves into the water. Fighting broke out between groups on the raft. When daylight returned, the survivors estimated that between 60 and 65 people had died during that single night. The disaster was no longer about reaching land. It was about whether any human order could survive on a platform where there was no dry place to stand. The remaining water casks had gone overboard during the violence. Wine was rationed in small portions, but it worsened confusion and conflict. Men hallucinated that they could see the coast. Some believed rescue boats were approaching. Others announced that they were going to fetch help, stepped into the sea, and disappeared. The second major outbreak of violence reduced the group again. By the fifth morning, the survivors wrote that only 30 remained, and no more than 20 could still stand. Hunger was not the only threat. Salt water had stripped the skin from their legs. Every wave reopened wounds. The sun intensified their thirst, but drinking seawater only made it worse. They bent metal into hooks and tried to catch fish. A bayonet was shaped into a hook for sharks. Nothing worked. Then a school of flying fish became trapped between the raft's timbers. It was one of the few moments when the ocean gave them food instead of taking people away. By then, some had begun eating the bodies of those who had died. This was not the single shocking act that defined the raft. It was one part of a larger collapse caused by exposure, dehydration, delirium, violence, and the near-total absence of provisions. If you value maritime stories that explain the decisions behind the disaster, subscribe to Deep Water, because the next decision on this raft was the hardest one to describe. The survivors had to calculate how long their remaining wine could last. According to the later museum account, on the 8th day, the strongest 15 threw the other living people overboard. The survivor narrative records other death decisions as well. 2 men caught stealing wine through a reed were executed under a rule the group had agreed upon. The testimony is openly defensive and political, which means it must be read as evidence from participants, not as a neutral camera. But it leaves no doubt that survival had become organized around deciding who could consume the last supplies. Afterward, the remaining men threw most of their weapons into the sea. They kept one saber in case they needed to cut wood or rope. They raised a small platform in the center so their bodies would no longer remain continuously submerged. On the 9th day, a white butterfly landed on their sail. It was a tiny event, but on the raft, every event became a possible sign. Butterflies and seabirds suggested that land might be near. The men watched the horizon and waited for the coast to appear. It never did. By the morning of July 17th, they were preparing to leave a written record of their names on the mast so that someone might eventually learn what had happened. Then, one of them saw a ship. The men tied colored cloth to barrel hoops and raised a person against the mast to wave them. For half an hour, they watched the distant brig. Some thought it was growing larger. Others saw it moving away. Then it disappeared. The 15 crawled beneath a piece of sail to escape the sun. They had enough wine for perhaps another day or two. Several could no longer move. 2 hours later, the master gunner looked outside and shouted. The brig was back, now less than half a mile away and sailing directly toward them. It was Argus, one of the ships from the original expedition. A boat came alongside the raft and lifted the weakest first. 10 of the 15 could barely move. Their bodies were burned, wounded, and covered in salt sores. After 13 days, the raft was empty. But survival did not end at rescue. 5 of the 15 died after reaching Senegal. The 10 who lived carried more than scars. 2 of them, the surgeon Henri Savigny and the engineer Alexandre Correard, published an account accusing the expedition's leadership of abandoning the raft and then attempting to soften the truth. Their testimony exploded into French public life. Captain Chaumares was court-martialed and sentenced to 3 years in prison. The governor resigned. The disaster became evidence of what could happen when loyalty and social rank replaced competence. Then, Théodore Géricault transformed that evidence into an image. His enormous painting does not show the grounding or the towline. It shows the moment hope becomes almost unbearable. Survivors climbing over bodies, waving toward a ship that may not see them. Géricault consulted survivors and built a model of the raft, but the painting is not a photograph. It is an indictment. That distinction matters. The familiar image can make the tragedy look like an unavoidable battle between people and the sea. The survivor testimony points somewhere else. Méduse grounded because of decisions. The raft was necessary because of decisions. Who entered the boats, what provisions reached the platform, and whether the tow continued were all decisions. The ocean determined how the raft drifted. People determined that it would drift alone. Do you think the disaster is best remembered as a survival story or as a failure of leadership? Tell me in the comments, and if you want another true story where one decision changed everything at sea, continue with the next deep water documentary on screen.